Hi everyone, my name is Sam Mack and I'm coming to you from my studio in St. Louis, and I'm going to answer some questions about my work with Galleri Urbane. So the title buff comes from the word buff, which I became sort of interested in because of it meaning like sort of these like, I was understanding it as meaning these like sort of three like wildly different things. In ceramics, buff is describing a state of clay, or sort of the physical quality of the clay once it reaches like a target temperature. And it also means sort of muscular person or muscular build of an individual. And thirdly, I was thinking about it in context of a car and, buffing out the surface of a car, buffing out a scratch, or sort of fixing an imperfection. And yeah, I was kind of, thinking about like buff as describing like an ideal, or, this like sort of arbitrary point in a process that, is getting you to an ideal. And just, the problematics of that, but also intending to point out that buff is just that. I mean, it's arbitrary. And yeah, and so in the show, I'm showing components of clay that, it's all the same clay body, and some of it is fired to its sort of target temperature and looks buff, or, would be described as buff, which is a sort of like beigey, sandy, sort of tannish quality to the surface of the clay. But then, if it's unfired clay, depending on if it's wet, it's like a really dark gray, and then if it's bone dry, so if it's like totally dry but it hasn't been fired yet, then it's this really light gray. Once it's bisque fired, so it just fired once, then it gets to this sort of like pinkish color. And then when it reaches its target temperature, it has the quality of buff. And then, if like as you fire it beyond its target temperature, when you fire it to a higher temperature, it changes in surface quality. It becomes much more like stone, and much more like compacted, and sort of yeah, it looks more of like almost like a rock or stone, or granite, or not granite, but like a yeah, just like a more condensed material. It's not so porous. And so I was incorporating all of the different states that this clay sort of exists in to also point to the arbitrary quality of buff as a signifier or as a descriptive word. And I think the same can be true of buff that describes like a sort of like muscular build, which a lot of times is considered to be ideal for men and people who are wanting to convey like a certain masculinity, right? There's this like weird assumption that there's going to be some like muscular quality associated with that. And then buff is buffing out imperfections, right? It was also thinking about like a scratch and the sort of like mark of action, or like accident or whatever. But this process of buffing is this process of removing history and removing imperfections and making things more like palatable in some sense. And so buff is not necessarily meant to like celebrate that word, but rather to think about it in a way that it's a little bit more complicated, and that it's just sort of this name that we've given to these like arbitrary points. So I think I'm really drawn to working in ceramics and stoneware because of almost everything about the material. It's a really responsive material, and that can have, you know, its drawbacks, but it also is one of the things that I find to be most incredible about the material. That different ways of handling it, different ways of letting it dry, different ways of firing it is going to yield all of these different results. And you can see them, you know, a lot of times in these sort of like stress cracks and things that form. And I'm really interested in encouraging cracks and fissures in the work where, you know, you can see it on the surface of the form, but then also it can, you know, add to the sort of precariousness in which the object is displayed or is sort of just like sitting on a table. If it's, you know, full of cracks, it is visually, you know, describing something that is quite different, you know, if you think about like a well-crafted object, and it's sort of, you know, pushing back against this idea that good craft can only be, you know, in one capacity or this sort of narrow definition of good craft. So yeah, it's, you know, a really responsive material, and also I'm really drawn to it because of this sort of familiarity that we have with it as being a functional material or used for functional objects. I mean, right, we see ceramics used in dinnerware, in mugs, in toilets, in sinks, in, you know, bathtubs, in tiles, and all of these different objects and tools that are useful to us in the way that we sort of like live our lives. And that inherent sort of function that exists within ceramics in this sort of way that we, you know, have come to understand it, I think is really important in the work that I'm making, not because my work is necessarily functional, right? None of it is. You can't really like drink out of it or, you know, use it, but it's functional in a narrative sense, and in a way of also sort of like making permanent these disposable objects, and, you know, these items that might be thrown away or, you know, are fear-mongered about, or any, you know, sort of iteration of that, where, you know, making it in ceramic makes it permanent in some capacity. And, you know, so I think that's also what's really important. And two, you know, it's a very ancient material, and there's just a huge sort of like feeling like limitless history that, you know, you're engaging with when you are creating things in ceramic. So, you know, this sort of idea of what gets archived and how things get archived, you know, is also coming into play in the work, and, you know, thinking about the way that, you know, ancient or historic ceramics and artifacts that are made of ceramics, you know, are archived and displayed. And, you know, that's also really, really present in the work. So all of these, I don't know, all aspects of the material are sort of all the time drawing me in, and in like ever expanding ways. So the objects that are adorning or affixed or sort of dangling from the vessels that I'm making are referencing, you know, objects from ceramic history, and they're also referencing contemporary objects that I'm using in my day-to-day life. And through the process of remaking them into ceramic, I am making them permanent, right? Because they're, you know, these forms in their original or sort of intended, you know, formal quality are meant to be disposed of after they're used. And so, you know, through my making them in ceramic, it gives them a permanence, and it's also connecting them to these objects from ceramic history, which, you know, is meant to I think, locate or contextualize these larger ideas and concepts that are informing the work as historic, right? And that they're not contemporary ideas, they're not contemporary concepts. They have been, you know, ever present. And, you know, what these objects are today, you know, are sort of like contemporary iterations of strategies to, you know, feel like okay and safe and, you know, not to be cliche, but, you know, at home in your body in some capacity. You know, so for instance, like transness is not a new concept. It's not a contemporary idea. It is a contemporary word, which is describing, you know, like a state of being that has long existed, as long as humans have existed. And, you know, trans is a contemporary word that is describing that. You know, so a lot of these objects are, you know, referencing tools and vessels and forms that, you know, I'm encountering in my day-to-day life. And so, you know, they're sort of creating throughout, you know, the whole of the work, it's sort of creating this like semi-diaristic vignette or still life of, you know, what it looks like for a trans person, and not, you know, every trans person, of course, but for me as like one trans person to navigate mobility across states, and, you know, what it looks like to be employed across different states, and to access the bathroom, you know, literally when you're driving on the highway across states and having to use a big gulp as a receptacle, because, you know, sometimes it feels safer to do that, you know, in the privacy of your own car than it is to engage with, you know, sort of an unknown of a public restroom, and, you know, who is going to be in that public restroom to sort of surveil or, you know, dictate, you know, who is allowed to be in that space or not. Yeah, so the objects are, you know, creating this sort of context, and are, you know, existing like on top of the vessels in a way that is reminiscent of archival or museum display, right? And this also gets into these ideas of who has institutional access to be able to dictate, you know, what gets archived, and the methods that are used to archive, and, you know, what then is useful for display. And, you know, so in a sense, it's like meant to sort of, you know, bring a lot of these different like forms, you know, across like time and space into one sort of location where we can look at them, you know, alongside one another, and what can we learn from a more complicated and nuanced, you know, navigation of history, and how that's informing our understanding of the present, and also how our understanding of the present informs what we know to be true, or, you know, the narratives that we know to be true from history. I don't know how I feel working in the studio, or, you know, when I'm making the work. I think when I'm starting to be able to visualize connections, you know, between pieces in the work, or between, you know, things that I'm making in the studio and things that I've read, or, you know, things that I've encountered from, you know, ceramic history, I think that's really exciting to me, and it can feel really exciting and generative and just really nourishing. And then I think it can also feel, you know, making work can also feel very frustrating if things aren't, you know, working at the pace that I think they should be, or, you know, if I break something as I'm sort of forming it that I'm not intending to break, and then I'm having to sort of negotiate with this process and this practice, and it causes me to slow down a lot, and it causes me to be a lot more considerate and careful as I'm working. And, you know, I do really appreciate that. I think about this material and about, you know, this method and this practice that I'm working with. And yeah, it encourages me to, I think, show a lot more care and not, you know, rush through things and not force things to be on a timeline, and just let things be, which, you know, I really appreciate. And I think we can all stand to slow down a little bit.